Some lessons in life come gently, whispered through the wisdom of parents or learned gradually through experience. But the most powerful lessons? They arrive like lightning strikes, sudden, shocking, and impossible to forget. This is the story of Marcus Wellington, a 13-year-old who believed his family's wealth could buy him immunity from consequences. In less than 60 seconds outside Buckingham Palace, he would discover just how wrong he was. What happened next would not only humble a spoiled child, but also reveal the true character of those who serve, protect, and teach without ever raising their voice in anger. Sometimes, the most profound transformations happen not through punishment, but through the morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the Wellington estate as 13-year-old Marcus adjusted his designer blazer for the third time. His reflection in the limousine window showed exactly what he wanted to see, the image of someone important, someone who mattered. The Armani Jr. suit had cost more than most people earned in a month, and Marcus knew it. More importantly, he wanted everyone else to know it too. "Remember your manners today, darling," his mother, Victoria Wellington, called from across the leather interior of their Bentley. She was busy applying her lipstick with the precision of someone accustomed to perfection in all things. "We're representing the family name." Marcus rolled his eyes, a gesture his mother couldn't see, but his father certainly could. Charles Wellington lowered his newspaper just enough to give his son a warning look. "Your mother's right, Marcus. Today isn't about you showing off. It's about honoring your grandfather's military service." The annual ceremony at Buckingham Palace was a tradition the Wellington family had maintained for over 30 years. Marcus's grandfather had served with distinction in the Royal Navy, earning several commendations that now hung proudly in their family library. Every year, they attended the memorial service for fallen servicemen, followed by a brief tour of the palace grounds. For most families, this would be the highlight of their year. For Marcus, it was simply another obligation in a life full of them. I know, Marcus muttered, turning back to the window. The London streets blurred past as their driver navigated through the morning traffic. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, clutching coffee cups and checking their phones. Marcus watched them with a mixture of curiosity and superiority. These were the people who lined up for hours just to catch a glimpse of the palace gates, while he walked through them as if he belonged there. The truth was, Marcus had been acting out more frequently lately. At his exclusive private school, Hartwell Academy, he had developed a reputation for being difficult. Just last week, he had challenged a teacher's authority in front of the entire class, refusing to apologize when confronted about not completing his assignment. His parents had been called in twice this month alone. Each time, his mother made excuses about the pressures of being young and wealthy, while his father wrote another generous check to the school's donation fund. "Perhaps we should have left him at home," Victoria whispered to her husband, though not quietly enough to escape Marcus's hearing. "He needs to learn respect," Charles replied firmly. "Maybe seeing real service members will give him some perspective." As they approached the palace, Marcus felt a familiar thrill. The sight of the iconic gates never failed to impress him, though he would never admit it. Tourists pressed against the railings, cameras clicking constantly as they tried to capture the perfect shot. The red-coated guards stood at attention, their tall black hats creating an imposing silhouette against the morning sky. Their driver pulled up to the VIP entrance, where a palace official checked their credentials before waving them through. This was the part Marcus enjoyed most, the moment when the tourists realized that some people didn't need to wait in lines or press against barriers. Some people belonged on the other side of the gates. The ceremony itself was held in one of the palace's smaller reception rooms, filled with families who had lost loved ones in service to the crown. Marcus sat between his parents, fidgeting with his phone despite repeated glances from his mother. The speeches about sacrifice and honor washed over him like background noise. These people talked about duty as if it were something noble, but Marcus saw it differently. His grandfather had simply done what was expected of him, just as Marcus was expected to attend these boring ceremonies. When the formal portion ended, the families were invited to walk through the palace gardens and view some of the exterior grounds. It was during this leisurely stroll that Marcus's patience finally reached its limit. His parents had stopped to chat with another couple, discussing investments and holiday plans with the casual ease of people who had never worried about money. Marcus wandered away, drawn by his own restlessness and the desire to find something more interesting than adult conversations about stock portfolios. The palace grounds were more extensive than most visitors realized. Beyond the main courtyard lay several smaller areas, each with its own purpose and character. Marcus found himself in a section he had never seen before, where the tourists were fewer and the atmosphere more relaxed. Here, away from the main crowds, he felt a sense of freedom that the formal ceremony had denied him. It was here that he first noticed the guard. The man stood at his post with the same rigid attention as all the others, but something about his position caught Marcus's interest. Unlike the guards at the main gate who were constantly photographed and admired, this one seemed almost forgotten. He was stationed near a side entrance that appeared to receive little traffic. His red tunic was immaculate, his black bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his rifle held at exactly the regulation angle. Marcus approached slowly, his curiosity overriding his usual boredom. He had always been told that the palace guards were not allowed to move or speak while on duty, no matter what happened around them. It was supposed to be a mark of their professionalism, but to Marcus, it seemed like a challenge. "Bet you get tired standing there all day," Marcus said casually, stopping a few feet away from the guard. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanging. This was exactly what Marcus had expected, but it only encouraged him to continue. Must be pretty boring just standing there while everyone else gets to walk around and actually do things, he pressed on, taking a step closer. "I mean, you can't even scratch your nose if it itches, right?" Still no response. Marcus felt a familiar surge of annoyance. Throughout his life, when he spoke, people listened. Teachers, shopkeepers, even adults at his parents' social gatherings. They all paid attention when a Wellington spoke. But this guard was treating him as if he didn't exist. "Hey," Marcus said, his voice louder now. "I'm talking to you." The morning air was crisp, and Marcus could see his breath as he spoke. Other visitors moved through the area, some glancing curiously at the boy who seemed to be having a one-sided conversation with the guard. But Marcus was too focused on his growing frustration to notice their looks. "You know, this whole silent treatment thing is pretty rude," he continued, his tone becoming more challenging. "I'm trying to be friendly here, and you're just ignoring me." The guard remained perfectly still, his breathing so controlled that his chest barely moved. His face, what Marcus could see of it beneath the bearskin hat, showed no sign that he had even heard the boy's words. This was exactly the kind of situation that brought out the worst in Marcus. All his life, when people didn't respond the way he wanted them to, his parents had intervened. Money changed hands, apologies were made, and Marcus got his way. But here was someone who couldn't be bought, couldn't be impressed by the Wellington name, and couldn't be intimidated by his family's influence. "Fine," Marcus said, his voice taking on the petulant tone that teachers at Hartwell Academy knew all too well. "If you want to play statue, I'll help you out." He began walking in a circle around the guard, studying him like a specimen in a museum. The man truly was impressive up close, probably 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his red tunic perfectly. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, and every brass button on his uniform caught the morning light. But to Marcus, all this precision and discipline just looked like showing off. "I bet you think you're really important, don't you?" Marcus said as he completed his circle. "Standing here in your fancy costume, pretending to guard something. But you know what? You're basically just a tourist attraction. People take pictures of you like you're a statue or something." A few other visitors had begun to notice the interaction, or rather, Marcus's monologue. An elderly couple slowed their walk to observe, the woman looking concerned. A family with young children moved closer, the parents seeming unsure whether they should intervene or simply watch. "Marcus!" The sharp call came from across the courtyard. His mother had noticed his absence and was now walking briskly toward him, her high heels clicking authoritatively on the stone pavement. Behind her, Charles Wellington followed with the measured pace of a man accustomed to cleaning up his son's messes. But Marcus was too caught up in his confrontation to pay attention to his approaching parents. The guard's continued silence had become a personal challenge, and he was determined to get some kind of reaction. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, moving even closer to the guard. "I think you're probably not even that tough. I bet underneath all that fancy dress-up, you're just a regular person who couldn't get a real job." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the morning sounds of the palace grounds continued, tourists talking, cameras clicking, the distant sound of traffic beyond the gates. But in the small space between Marcus and the guard, there seemed to be a bubble of tense silence. The guard's expression remained unchanged, his eyes focused on some distant point that Marcus couldn't see. But there was something in his stillness now that was different from before. It wasn't just the rigid discipline of military training. It was the controlled patience of someone who had dealt with far greater challenges than one spoiled teenager. "I'm talking to you," Marcus said again, his voice rising with frustration. "The least you could do is look at me. Marcus Wellington." His mother's voice was closer now, sharp with embarrassment and authority. "Get away from there this instant." But it was too late. Marcus had reached the point where his anger overtook his judgment completely. All the frustration of the boring ceremony, all the resentment at being dragged to another family obligation, all the accumulated irritation of a life where nothing ever seemed quite exciting enough. It all focused on this one silent figure who refused to acknowledge his existence. "Fine," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you won't talk to me, maybe I can find another way to get your attention." He reached out toward the guard's rifle. The movement was quick, casual, as if Marcus were simply curious about the weapon. His fingers had barely made contact with the polished wood of the rifle stock when everything changed. The guard moved with a speed that defied explanation. One moment he was a statue, perfectly still and silent. The next, Marcus found himself flat on his back on the stone pavement, the guard hand firmly, but not roughly pinning his wrist. The entire motion had taken perhaps 2 seconds, executed with such fluid precision that most of the onlookers didn't even realize what had happened until it was over. Marcus lay there, stunned not just by the physical reversal, but by the complete shock of it. No one had ever handled him this way. His parents occasionally raised their voices. His teachers sometimes scolded him, but no one had ever simply and efficiently stopped him from doing exactly what he wanted to do. The guard looked down at him for the first time, and Marcus found himself staring into a pair of steel-gray eyes that held no anger, no satisfaction at having put the boy in his place. There was only a calm professionalism and, perhaps, though Marcus wasn't sure, a hint of something that might have been understanding. "Son," the guard said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't immediately identify. "You don't touch the rifle." The words were simple, spoken without heat or condescension. They weren't a threat or a warning for future behavior. They were just a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty as saying the sky was blue or water was wet. Marcus tried to sit up, but the guard's grip remained firm. Not painful, not aggressive, but absolutely unmovable. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered was watching with a mixture of shock and fascination. Some of the tourists had their phones out, though whether they were recording or simply holding them in surprise, Marcus couldn't tell. "Let go of me," Marcus said, though his voice had lost all its earlier bravado. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," the guard replied, still in that same calm tone. "You're a 13-year-old boy who's having a very bad morning." The simple accuracy of this statement hit Marcus harder than any angry response might have. He was having a bad morning, though until this moment he might have described it as boring rather than bad. More importantly, the guard had somehow looked at him and seen not a Wellington heir or a wealthy young man or any of the other identities Marcus had tried on over the years. He had seen simply what he was, a 13-year-old boy. "Marcus!" Victoria Wellington's voice was sharp with panic as she finally reached them. "Oh my God, what happened? Are you hurt? Get your hands off my son immediately." The guard looked up at her with the same calm attention he had given Marcus. Ma'am, your son attempted to handle my weapon. I've simply restrained him for everyone's safety. He's just a child. Victoria protested, though her voice had lost some of its initial fury. The guard's professional demeanor was having its effect on her as well. Yes, ma'am, which is why I used minimal force, and he's completely unharmed. Charles Wellington arrived a moment later, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with his son's confrontations before. Unlike his wife, he didn't immediately begin making demands or threats. Instead, he studied the situation, noting the guard's calm professionalism, his son's obvious shock, and the small crowd of witnesses. What exactly happened here? Charles asked. The guard released Marcus's wrist and helped the boy to his feet with surprising gentleness. Marcus stood unsteadily, his face flushed with embarrassment as he realized how many people were watching. This wasn't how these confrontations usually ended. Usually, his parents swept in with apologies and explanations, smoothing things over with their influence and checkbook. But something about this situation felt different. Your son was curious about my equipment, the guard said diplomatically. I simply ensured that curiosity didn't lead to an unsafe situation. Marcus looked up at the guard, searching his face for any sign of mockery or satisfaction. But there was none. The man had physically overpowered him with embarrassing ease, demonstrated that all of Marcus's bluster was meaningless, and then helped him to his feet as if nothing significant had happened. Marcus started to speak, then stopped. For the first time in his life, he found himself completely at a loss for words. Are you injured? Charles asked his son, though it was clear that the guard had been careful not to hurt him. Marcus shook his head, still staring at the guard. The man had returned to his post and was once again standing at perfect attention, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a brief interruption in his day. But now Marcus could see something in that stillness that he had missed before. It wasn't just discipline or training. It was a kind of strength that had nothing to do with physical power. We should go, Victoria said, taking Marcus's arm. This has been quite enough excitement for one day. But Marcus didn't move. He was still looking at the guard, trying to understand what had just happened. All his life, when people had stopped him from doing something, it had been with explanations or negotiations or threats of consequences. His parents reasoned with him. His teachers bargained with him. Even the police officer who had once caught him driving his father's car underage had spent 20 minutes explaining why it was illegal and dangerous. This guard had simply stopped him. No lectures, no threats, no appeals to his better nature. Just a calm, efficient action that made it impossible for Marcus to do what he wanted to do, followed by an equally calm explanation of reality. Son, the guard said quietly, and Marcus realized the man was speaking directly to him again. You might want to move along with your parents now. It wasn't a command or a threat. It was almost a suggestion, spoken with the same professional courtesy the guard might use with any visitor. But Marcus heard something else in it, a kind of respect that he wasn't used to receiving. The guard wasn't treating him like a spoiled child or a problem to be managed. He was treating him like a person who was capable of making better choices. Marcus nodded slowly and turned to follow his parents. But after a few steps, he stopped and looked back. Thank you, he said quietly. The guard's eyes shifted slightly, meeting Marcus's for just a moment. He nodded once, a gesture so small that anyone not watching carefully might have missed it. As the Wellington family walked away, Marcus found himself thinking about that nod. It hadn't been condescending or dismissive. It had been the kind of acknowledgement that passed between equals, between two people who understood something important about each other. For the rest of the walk through the palace grounds, Marcus remained unusually quiet. His parents assumed he was sulking, embarrassed by the public confrontation. Victoria whispered to Charles about filing a complaint, though her husband seemed less inclined toward that course of action. They had both seen enough of Marcus's behavior to recognize when he had been the one in the wrong. But Marcus wasn't sulking. He was thinking about the guard's eyes, about the calm way he had handled the situation, about the complete absence of anger or vindictiveness in his actions. Most of all, he was thinking about those 4 simple words, "You don't touch the rifle." Not, you can't touch the rifle, or you're not allowed to touch the rifle. Just, you don't touch the rifle. As if it were a basic fact about how the world worked, as natural and unchangeable as gravity. The ride home in the Bentley was quiet, each member of the Wellington family lost in their own thoughts. Victoria was composing the complaint letter she would never actually send. Charles was wondering if perhaps his son had finally encountered something that might actually teach him a lesson. And Marcus was staring out the window, seeing the London streets with different eyes than he had that morning. When they arrived at their estate, Marcus went directly to his room instead of joining his parents for their usual post-event discussion over afternoon tea. He sat at his desk, still wearing his expensive suit, and stared at his reflection in the window. The boy looking back at him seemed smaller somehow, though nothing about his appearance had actually changed. For the first time in his 13 years, Marcus Wellington was beginning to understand the difference between being important and being significant. The guard had been significant in a way that had nothing to do with money or family names or expensive clothes. He had possessed something that Marcus realized he wanted more than anything else he had ever desired. The quiet strength that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you stood for. That evening at dinner, Marcus's parents were surprised when he didn't immediately launch into complaints about the day or demands for compensation for his embarrassment. Instead, he ate his meal quietly, occasionally asking questions about his grandfather's military service that he had never shown interest in before. Grandfather was in the Navy, right? Marcus asked as their chef served the main course. Yes, for 12 years, Charles replied, pleased by his son's sudden interest. He served on 3 different ships and earned several commendations for his service during the Falklands conflict. What kind of commendations? Victoria and Charles exchanged glances. This was the first time Marcus had asked about anything related to his grandfather's military career, despite years of attending memorial services and family discussions about duty and service. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during a rescue mission, Charles explained. His ship had orders to evacuate civilians from a contested area, and when their helicopter was shot down, your grandfather volunteered to go ashore to retrieve the survivors. Marcus set down his fork, his attention completely focused on his father's words. He volunteered? Of course. That's what service members do. They volunteer for dangerous assignments because someone needs to do them. The concept of volunteering for danger, of choosing to put yourself at risk for strangers, was something Marcus had never seriously considered. His world was built around avoiding discomfort and seeking pleasure. The idea that someone might deliberately choose the harder path, not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do, was completely foreign to his experience. Is that why people become guards at the palace? Marcus asked. Because they want to serve? Charles studied his son's face, noting the genuine curiosity there. Many of them, yes. The guards you see at Buckingham Palace are active military personnel. They've chosen to serve their country, and they take that responsibility very seriously. Marcus nodded slowly, remembering the steel-gray eyes that had looked at him with such calm authority. The guard hadn't been playing a role or putting on a show for tourists. He had been doing his job, fulfilling a responsibility that he had voluntarily accepted. That night, Marcus lay in bed thinking about responsibility and choice. For the first time, he began to consider the possibility that strength might come not from getting what you wanted, but from choosing to do what needed to be done, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. The next morning brought the usual routine of preparation for school, but Marcus found himself paying attention to details he had previously ignored. His uniform, pressed and laid out by their housekeeper, suddenly seemed less like a costume and more like a symbol of belonging to something larger than himself. As he knotted his school tie, he found himself trying to match the precision he had observed in the guard's appearance. At Hartwell Academy, Marcus's classmates immediately noticed the change in his behavior. Where he had previously dominated conversations with boasts about his family's wealth or complaints about teachers and assignments, he now listened more than he spoke. When their history teacher, Mr. Pemberton, began a lesson about World War II, Marcus raised his hand for the first time in months. Yes, Marcus. Mr. Pemberton said, barely able to hide his surprise. What made people volunteer for dangerous missions during the war? I mean, they could have just done the minimum required and stayed safe. The question caught the entire class off guard. This was the same Marcus Wellington who had once argued that studying military history was pointless because wars were just politicians making poor people fight each other. Now he was asking about the motivations behind voluntary sacrifice. That's an excellent question, Marcus, Mr. Pemberton replied, his tone reflecting genuine interest. There were many factors, patriotism, certainly, but also a sense of duty to their fellow soldiers and to the people they were sworn to protect. Many felt that if they didn't volunteer for the dangerous assignments, someone else would have to, and they couldn't live with that knowledge. Marcus nodded, thinking about the guard who had stopped him from making a serious mistake without any anger or desire for revenge. The man had simply done what needed to be done, efficiently, and without fanfare. During lunch, Marcus's friends, though that term had always been somewhat questionable, given that most of them spent time with him primarily because of his family's wealth and social position, noticed his unusual quietness. "What's wrong with you today?" asked Nigel Ashworth, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels. "You've barely said a word all morning." "Nothing's wrong," Marcus replied. "I'm just thinking about some things." "Like what? Please tell me you're not still upset about having to go to that boring palace thing yesterday." Marcus looked at his friend, really looked at him for the first time in a long while. Nigel was 2 years older than Marcus, but seemed somehow younger, his face soft with the kind of perpetual comfort that came from never having been seriously challenged or disappointed. In his expression, Marcus saw a reflection of his own face from just 24 hours earlier. "Wasn't boring," Marcus said quietly. "Actually, it was pretty interesting." The conversation moved on to other topics, complaints about teachers, plans for upcoming holidays, gossip about classmates, but Marcus found himself increasingly disconnected from it all. The things that had seemed important yesterday now felt trivial, like games played by children who didn't understand that the adult world operated by completely different rules. When he arrived home that afternoon, Marcus made an unusual request. Instead of going to his room or joining his friends for video games, he asked his father if he could see his grandfather's military commendations. Charles Wellington was so surprised by this request that he nearly dropped the financial report he was reading. Marcus had shown no interest in family history or military service throughout his childhood, despite their annual visits to memorial ceremonies and the prominent display of his grandfather's honors in their home library. "Of course," Charles said, setting aside his papers. "They're in the library. I'll show you." The Wellington family library was an impressive room, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books and decorated with portraits of family members dating back several generations. But Marcus had always been drawn to the television and gaming systems in other parts of the house, spending as little time as possible in what he considered the most boring room in their home. Now, as his father led him to a glass display case he had walked past hundreds of times without really seeing, Marcus felt a strange sense of anticipation. "Here they are," Charles said, opening the case with a small key he kept in his desk. The Distinguished Service Cross, the General Service Medal, and his campaign ribbons from the Falklands. Marcus stared at the medals, tried to imagine his grandfather as a young man, making the decision to volunteer for a dangerous mission. The medals were tarnished with age, and the ribbons had faded slightly, but they still carried an undeniable weight of significance. "What was he like?" Marcus asked. "I mean, what kind of person was he?" Charles smiled at the memory. He was quiet, mostly not the kind of person who told stories about his service or boasted about his achievements. He believed in doing his duty without seeking recognition for it. Your grandmother used to say that he was the strongest person she knew, but not because he could lift heavy things or win fights. He was strong because he always did what he thought was right, even when it was difficult. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand something about the nature of real strength. The guard at Buckingham Palace had possessed the same quality his grandfather had described, the ability to do what was right without seeking praise or recognition for it. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, still staring at the medals. "Of course. Do you think I'm spoiled?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Charles studied his son's face, noting the genuine concern there, the absence of the defensive attitude that usually accompanied Marcus's rare moments of self-reflection. "I think," Charles said carefully, "that you've been given many advantages in life, and sometimes advantages can become obstacles if we're not careful." "What do you mean?" "Well, when everything comes easily to you, it can be hard to develop the skills you need when things don't go your way. You've never really had to work for anything or deal with serious consequences for your actions. That's not entirely your fault. Your mother and I wanted to give you everything we didn't have when we were growing up. But maybe we gave you so much that we forgot to give you the chance to earn things for yourself." Marcus absorbed this, thinking about all the times his parents had smoothed over his conflicts, paid his way out of trouble, or made excuses for his behavior. He had interpreted their interventions as love, but now he wondered if they might have been something else entirely. "The guard at the palace yesterday," Marcus said slowly, "he didn't care who I was or how much money our family has. No, I don't suppose he did. And he still treated me with respect, even after I was rude to him." Charles nodded, beginning to understand the impact of the previous day's events on his son. Military personnel are trained to maintain their professionalism regardless of how others behave. But I think what you experienced was more than just professional training. "What do you mean?" "I think you met someone who understands that respect isn't something you can demand or buy. It's something you earn through your actions, and it's something you can give to others regardless of how they treat you." That evening, Marcus asked to skip his usual activities, video games with friends, television in his room, or browsing social media on his phone, and instead spent time reading about military service and the history of the Royal Guards. What he discovered fascinated him in a way that few things ever had. The guards at Buckingham Palace were not, as he had assumed, simply ceremonial figures or tourist attractions. They were active military personnel from the British Army's elite regiments, trained soldiers who took their duties seriously regardless of how trivial those duties might appear to outsiders. Many had served in combat zones around the world before being selected for palace duty. They were chosen not just for their military skills, but for their ability to maintain absolute professionalism under all circumstances. Reading about their selection process, their training, and their service records, Marcus began to understand why the guard had been able to handle his confrontation with such calm efficiency. The man had probably faced far greater challenges than one spoiled teenager, and he had learned to respond to pressure with controlled, purposeful action rather than emotional reaction. More importantly, Marcus learned about the concept of service itself, the idea that some people chose to dedicate their lives to something larger than their own immediate desires or comfort. These were people who voluntarily accepted responsibility for protecting others, who chose duty over convenience, who found meaning in service rather than in personal gain. This was a completely foreign concept to Marcus, who had spent his entire life focused on what he wanted, what he deserved, and what his family's money could buy him. The idea that someone might find satisfaction in serving others, in putting the needs of strangers before their own comfort, challenged everything he had believed about how the world worked. As he closed the book he had been reading, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 48 hours earlier. He was going to find a way to return to Buckingham Palace, not as a tourist, or because his family had connections, but to apologize properly to the guard he had disrespected. The next morning, Marcus approached his father with a request that left Charles Wellington speechless. "I want to go back to the palace," Marcus said over breakfast. "I want to apologize to that guard." Victoria looked up from her coffee, surprised. "Apologize?" "Marcus, you don't need to apologize to anyone. If anything, that man should apologize to you for handling you so roughly." But Charles held up a hand, his attention focused entirely on his son. "Why do you want to apologize, Marcus?" "Because I was wrong," Marcus said simply. "I was rude to him, and he was just doing his job. He could have gotten me in real trouble, but instead he just stopped me from making a bigger mistake. And I never even thanked him properly." The sincerity in his son's voice convinced Charles that this wasn't just a passing whim or an attempt to get attention. Something genuine had shifted in Marcus's understanding of the world. Apologizing is the right thing to do, Charles agreed. But you can't just walk up to a guard on duty and expect to have a conversation with him. There are protocols. Then what do I do? Charles thought for a moment. I have a friend who works in the palace administration. Let me make some calls and see if we can arrange something appropriate. The process took several days and involved more bureaucracy than Marcus had expected. His father's friend had to contact the head of palace security, who in turn had to speak with the commanding officer of the guard unit. There were questions about Marcus's intentions, assurances needed about his behavior, and forms to be filled out documenting the unusual request. But eventually an arrangement was made. Marcus would be permitted to meet with the guard, whose name, they learned, was Sergeant James Morrison, during his off-duty time in a private room within the palace complex. The meeting would be brief and supervised, and Marcus would need to demonstrate appropriate respect and behavior throughout. When the day arrived, Marcus dressed carefully in his best suit, but this time his attention to appearance wasn't about showing off his family's wealth. Instead, he wanted to demonstrate that he understood the seriousness of the occasion and respected the person he was meeting. The drive to the palace was quieter than their previous visits. Victoria had initially objected to the entire plan, arguing that it was unnecessary and potentially embarrassing for the family. But Charles had supported his son's decision, recognizing it as a sign of genuine growth and maturity. "Remember," Charles told Marcus as they approached the palace gates, "this man has agreed to meet with you as a favor. He doesn't owe you anything, and he could have easily refused this request. Be respectful, be genuine, and don't take up more of his time than necessary." Marcus nodded, his stomach tight with nervous energy. This was unlike any social situation he had ever experienced. Usually, when he met adults, they were either his parents' friends who treated him with indulgent familiarity or service personnel who were polite because they were being paid to be. This was different. He was meeting someone who had no obligation to like him, forgive him, or make him feel comfortable about his past behavior. They were escorted through a different entrance than the one they had used for the memorial ceremony, through corridors that were clearly working areas of the palace rather than spaces designed for public viewing. The walls were painted in practical colors rather than the rich decorations Marcus had seen elsewhere. And the people they passed were clearly staff members going about their daily business rather than tourists or dignitaries. Finally, they arrived at a small meeting room, furnished with a simple table and several chairs. Marcus's escort, a polite but efficient woman from the palace administration, explained that Sergeant Morrison would join them shortly. "I'll wait outside," Charles told his son. "This is your apology to make." Marcus nodded, taking a seat at the table and trying to calm his racing heart. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say dozens of times, but now that the moment was approaching, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. When Sergeant Morrison entered the room, Marcus was struck again by the man's presence. Out of his ceremonial uniform, wearing simple civilian clothes, he looked different, but no less impressive. There was still that quality of calm strength about him, the sense that he was someone who could be counted on in difficult situations. "Good afternoon, Marcus," Sergeant Morrison said, taking a seat across from him. His voice was the same as Marcus remembered, calm, professional, but not unfriendly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Marcus began, proud that his voice didn't shake. "I know you didn't have to do this." "You're right, I didn't have to," the sergeant agreed. "But when someone asks to apologize, I think it's worth listening to what they have to say." Marcus took a deep breath and began the speech he had practiced. But as soon as he started talking, he realized that his prepared words weren't what he really wanted to say. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart, saying things he hadn't even known he was thinking. "I was awful to you," he said simply. "I was rude and disrespectful, and I acted like I was better than you when the truth is, you're probably a better person than I'll ever be. You were just doing your job, and I tried to make it harder for you because I was bored and frustrated about things that had nothing to do with you." Sergeant Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive. "But what I really want to apologize for," Marcus continued, is that I completely misunderstood what you represent. I thought you were just standing there like a decoration, but you were actually serving something important. You had volunteered to take on a responsibility that I couldn't even understand, and instead of respecting that, I tried to make fun of it. Go on, the sergeant said quietly when Marcus paused. I've been thinking about my grandfather, Marcus said. He served in the Navy, and I never really understood why that mattered. But now I think I'm beginning to understand that some people choose to serve something bigger than themselves, and that's actually the most important thing anyone can do. Sergeant Morrison nodded slowly. Your grandfather sounds like he was a good man. I think he was, and I think you were too. And I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out. They sat in silence for a moment, and Marcus wondered if his apology had been adequate or if there was something else he should say. But Sergeant Morrison seemed to be considering his words carefully, and Marcus didn't want to rush him. Can I tell you something, Marcus? The sergeant finally said. Yes, sir. I've been a Royal Guard for 3 years, and before that I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. In all that time, you're the first person who has ever apologized to me for anything. Do you know what that means? Marcus shook his head. It means that you have the potential to be something most people never become. Someone who can recognize when they've made a mistake and take responsibility for fixing it. That's rarer than you might think, especially among people who come from privilege. The words hit Marcus harder than any criticism could have. He had expected Sergeant Morrison to accept his apology politely and send him on his way. He hadn't expected to be told that he had done something exceptional. I don't feel exceptional, Marcus admitted. I feel like I've been acting like a spoiled brat for my entire life. Maybe you have, the sergeant said with a slight smile. But the difference between a spoiled brat and a mature person isn't whether you've made mistakes. It's whether you learn from them. How do I learn from them? That's up to you. But I can tell you what I learned when I was around your age and making my own share of mistakes. What? I learned that the world doesn't revolve around me, and that the most interesting people I knew were the ones who had found something to care about besides themselves. Some people care about their families, some care about their communities, some care about their country or their faith or their profession. But the people who only care about their own comfort and pleasure, they're usually pretty boring, even to themselves. Marcus thought about his friends at school, about their endless conversations about material possessions and social status, about how empty those conversations had begun to seem in recent days. What do you care about? He asked. I care about doing my duty well, about being someone my fellow soldiers can count on, and about serving something that's bigger than my own immediate wants, Sergeant Morrison replied. It doesn't make me special, but it makes my life feel meaningful. How did you figure out what you wanted to serve? I didn't figure it out all at once. It was more like a series of small decisions, each one leading to the next. First, I decided I wanted to be useful. Then, I decided I wanted to be dependable. Then, I decided I wanted to be part of something that mattered. Eventually, those decisions led me to military service. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand that the transformation he was hoping for wouldn't happen overnight. It would require a series of choices, each one slightly better than the last. Sergeant Morrison, he said, would it be possible for me to write to you sometimes? I don't mean to bother you or take up your time, but I think I'm going to need some guidance figuring out how to be a better person, and you're the first adult who's talked to me like I could actually become one. The sergeant studied Marcus's face for a long moment, as if weighing something important. I think I'll be fine, he said finally, but I have some conditions. What are they? First, you have to understand that becoming a better person is your responsibility, not mine. I can offer advice, but you have to do the work. Second, you have to be honest with me about your struggles and your mistakes. I don't have time for someone who just wants to be told how wonderful they are. And third, you have to start putting what you learn into practice in your real life, not just in our letters. I agree to all of that, Marcus said immediately. Don't agree so quickly. Think about what I'm asking. I'm asking you to take responsibility for your own growth, to be honest about your failures, and to actually change your behavior. That's hard work, and most people aren't willing to do it. Marcus considered this carefully. Everything the sergeant was asking sounded difficult and uncomfortable. It would be much easier to continue living as he had been, letting his parents smooth over his problems, and using his family's wealth to avoid consequences for his actions. But as he thought about the emptiness he had begun to feel in his old way of living, about the boredom and frustration that had led him to confront the guard in the first place, he realized that easy wasn't the same as good. "I want to do the hard work," he said finally. "I'm tired of being the kind of person who doesn't stand for anything." Sergeant Morrison extended his hand across the table. "Then, we have an agreement." As Marcus shook the sergeant's hand, he felt something shift inside himself. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. He was still the same person he had been when he walked into the room. But he now had something he had never possessed before, a clear sense of the person he wanted to become, and a guide who could help him get there. The meeting ended shortly after that, but as Marcus rejoined his father and they left the palace, he felt as though his real education was just beginning.